everyone. The goal of this talk is to just give you a quick introduction to the Builder Funnel model that we've been using for the last few years, kind of the thinking that went behind that model, and why we're trying to, what the structure is as the teams that have been implementing that model are shifting around, just kind of share the ideas and knowledge that went into making that model in the first place. And yeah, the main goal for this is for it to get recorded, and then we'll have a discussion about it over time. But this is just trying to summarize the strategy that has been at play over time. So I'll kind of start with motivation quickly, and then go from that motivation into the model that we built, and then the results over time, and then talk a bit about kind of the remainder of 2024. So just as a high-level motivation, decentralized networks are very complex, large systems, right? Their components themselves tend to be whole projects or services individually. Each of those projects or services requires a huge amount of work to develop and build and so on. Separate from that, platform products require applications, meaning if you're building a platform, computing platform of any sort, the success of that platform requires the success of the applications on top, meaning that a platform is really only as successful as the applications on top of it, which means that you need a robust ecosystem by which applications can develop on top of those on those platforms. All of these things, applications, projects, services, and so on, require highly profitable teams. Some teams can run very close to sustainability levels. Some teams can, reach some plateau and then just maintain over time. But for the most part, most of the success in these kinds of systems comes from highly profitable growth teams over time. This is because building things is extremely expensive, right? It requires many millions of dollars per year to build things in general. And when you get into larger and larger scale things, you get into the tens to hundreds of millions run rate type of things. So profitability for the whole platform as a whole requires successful business models of the applications and services that are going to be built. Now, startup creation can be greatly accelerated. Here's another component that I think is a key part when thinking about these kinds of systems. There's lots of examples in history that you can point to about how to accelerate that creation in terms of startups. But what is often not talked about is that platform projects tend to apply these kind of acceleration systems in general. So here's a bunch of inspiration that went into the design of the Builders Funnel over time. So two of the key programs that we looked at, one was the beginning of the iPhone platform. So when iOS first started and the iPhone was first launched, I guess when the App Store was first launched, so this was like a year after the iPhone first started, there was a whole bunch of development put in place to help a generation of developers come into this new paradigm, to be able to program this new type of computer, to be able to program it in these new deployment and so on. Apple invested a huge amount of effort into building classes, into building training programs, they got Kleiner Perkins at the time to have a $100 million iFund that was just dedicated to funding applications that we're building on iOS, and so on. And this was required for about 2 to 6 years of stimulating the growth of the iOS ecosystem. And so this was a very deliberate, well-structured set of programs. So this wasn't happening by accident. It wasn't like Apple just building it and they will come. This was Apple very intentionally building a whole set of structures to try and stimulate the growth of that platform in a pretty fast pace. You can look at cloud platforms as well, and they've done the same type of thing. AWS is one example here. Google Cloud and others have done the same thing. They've run a whole slew of startup programs that include things like, famously the credits that you could get as a young startup. You get on the order of 150K to 300K in credits to be able to use the platform. There's all kinds of connectivity to a lot of the existing startup ecosystem, meaning they tend to deploy a lot of their credits and programs through existing accelerators and existing hackathons. Amazon and others tended to sponsor tons of existing hackathons and in the traditional tech ecosystem. So there's again a very, very intentional approach to stimulating the growth and development of lots of applications. You can also think of startup ecosystems in general, things like creating a good seeding ground for building startups. Think of like early stage capital, angel investment, VC, and so on. In the crypto space, because these crypto platforms ended up being really different from the traditional tech, a lot of the traditional structures for traditional tech systems didn't quite work. So you couldn't quite use the existing hackathons that already existed in the normal world, and a lot of the traditional startup programs or accelerators and so on didn't quite work for the crypto space. There are some, of course, notable exceptions, but for the most part, the crypto industry had to develop its own version of all of these things. And the most successful ecosystems had, again, a very robust set of intentionally built programs. Everything from hackathon programs, VC programs, accelerators, and so on. And these aren't like a single team doing this. This is usually a large ecosystem in and of itself that includes lots of different participants that are creating some valuable and successful component in that larger picture, right? So the people that like run the hackathons themselves are running a business as part of doing that, and that needs to be a profitable and successful thing. And they can generate over time, thing by thing, just a large number of projects coming into an ecosystem. Similarly, accelerators do the same thing, right? So an accelerator itself is a profitable business, or it needs to be in order to survive. That'll have a set of batches, and over time generate a set of companies. So this is kind of like the broad inspiration for the Builders Funnel that we built over time. Here's a way of looking at it, and why we call it a Builders Funnel is because you can think of vast swaths of people starting on one end. You can think of hundreds of thousands to millions of people being exposed to first educational material that gets them to understand various things about a platform and various things about the applications to build with and so on. From that basic education, and this includes all of your traditional dev documentation. It includes tutorials. It includes case studies. There's a whole swath of different things here in just the education part of it. From there, you can support a set of those people that then choose to build with something and create programs or systems that can increase the likelihood that they'll actually go and build something. Meaning you can create forcing functions for doing some of this work. Meaning, traditionally things like hackathons play this role because hackathons give you a fixed time allocation where a set of people are going to go and do a project. They're going to build on a set of technologies. They have a well-defined ending point. They have to pitch that thing to people. Hackathons, as a rule, they tend to prioritize projects that are clearly useful to people. So they do a lot of the product development type thing already in a kind of compressed time frame. We have found that the most successful of these for us are the 3 to 4 week hackathon programs as opposed to the very short ones. These tend to generate much more successful teams that go on to build lots of things. But hackathons are not the only such program, right? You can think of many other programs in this phase. Things like dev guilds, things like just mentoring and support programs. We ran the FVM the FVM Builders program, which supported a lot of builders in the FVM community to build with the platform and get to deploy their thing and so on. That's another example of the kind of program that fits in this spot. Kind of beyond that, once you go from like one individual person working on a thing or a very small group of people working on a thing for a fixed point in time, and they find something that they want to do longer term, where they're going to be doing it for a larger period of time, at that point now they need to be able to sustain their team and their organization. And this is where there tends to be the biggest bottlenecks. You can usually find a lot of people beforehand that will hack on things and try to build things. And there'll be this gap between that moment and when they can actually do this full time as a team in a longer period of time. This is where I think we don't have enough programs. I think that there's some in place already, but I think this is kind of like a big bottleneck. Micro grants here are an example program that we've tried, where for a set of hackathon participants and hackathon winners, some of those tend to win hackathon prizes, and that gives them a little bit of funding to then be able to continue. But sometimes you need a bit more than that, or sometimes there are teams that don't come through hackathons. They find the community a different way, and this is where kind of like a next step micro grant program can be very useful. And these usually are very small grants that just support a team for a month, maybe 2 months, to try and see if the thing they're building is going to be a successful thing. From there, you can have accelerator programs that then help support the growth of teams. Today, accelerators are tuned primarily for VC-style businesses. So these accelerator programs only apply to a subset of teams that are in the VC-type track. What we're missing is accelerator-type things for teams that are building kind of like more blue teams, or teams that are building public goods-type structures. And there's kind of an opening there for a program like that can help support a set of small teams that are building critical components in a larger system. Further after that, then you start getting into investment. And here investment is the very early stages of investment. This is not kind of like larger scale VC funding. This is like the beginning of traditional investing, which means angel investing or pre-seed funds and so on. So this is like smaller amounts of money, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. This is far away from like the VC scale. And this, you can think of each of these stages as, having their own conversion rate. You can think of, only a fraction of people go from, not knowing about the ecosystem to finding about it. Then some fraction of those decide to build something. Some fraction of those decide to actually like enter some program like a hackathon or something like that. Only a fraction of those decide to continue building their thing. Only a small fraction of those find some success or find some people that are willing to fund it. Only a fraction of those end up building a business and whatnot. So in general, the conversions here are really punishing. Like we're talking about very, very small conversion rates, so sub 1% in a lot of places. And this is just what it looks like in the world. Like when you think about the large number of people that have ever tried to build an iPhone app, or the large number of people that have ever tried to build something with AWS, you hit millions to tens of millions or more. And from there, you have like this massive funnel that like subsamples down to the small groups that end up succeeding. So a key thing though is like if you in these kind of systems, if you have like a missing stage here, the conversion can get very bad. Meaning like you can if you don't have support structures along the way to even achieve that 1% or sub 1% conversion rate, your conversion rate might actually be like dramatically worse. And you end up in a way worse spot. So you kind of have to do the like systems info gathering of like how all of this is working, and then think through over time at each stage kind of how things are progressing, or what other programs could be built along the way. And by the way, this is like a subset of programs that you could imagine. You could think of also inventing crypto native type versions of these things, right? So already here, hackathons, microgrants, and accelerators today are run in traditional ways. You could imagine running these things with smart contracts. You could run some of these microgrant programs automatically on chain with like a DAO, right? A DAO could decide, hey, pitches your project, we deploy a little bit of money, and you could deploy a whole microgrant thing entirely on chain. Here's another view of this same kind of thing. You can think of like, team nucleation periods, which is kind of how you go from individuals with potential ideas to, okay, deciding to go do something. Things like requests for startups can help. Things like competitions can help. Famously in a lot of universities, they do like these business plan competitions. It's kind of like the equivalent of a request for startups in a sense, although less directed. Again, there's things like next step grants and whatnot. I tend to separate out the pathway between like a VC style business and so on from a team that's going to go and either get grant funding or get funding through like doing contract work or things like that. That just ends up being just a different type of business. So I'll talk a little bit about results in general, and then I'll flag a little bit of the remainder of 2024. So here's an example of like hackathons over time. This is like a snapshot of like how we look at a set of things. We work with a lot of different hackathon groups around the world. This includes both Filecoin specific hackathons or hackathons where Filecoin has a price in it. We end up with like thousands of submissions per year. Like over time, I think the total so far has been like 60 or 70,000 hackathon submissions. And then of those, like only a very small fraction end up making it into teams later on. Then we also work with a set of accelerator programs to help support a number of the teams that operate. We're talking each of these accelerator programs tends to be much more time intensive, much more work to run one of these things. Again, each of these programs will have somewhere between 10 to 30 teams per batch. Usually these programs will do 2 batches per year. And so we're now kind of narrowing down to much smaller numbers. And again, by VC math, most accelerator teams never make it, right? So in the longer term, very few of those teams will actually end up being successful. That's just kind of how hard it is to build successful things. Now, kind of post accelerators or kind of around accelerators, especially for teams that didn't go through that, there's a range of programs that we've built over time to help support a lot of those teams. Everything from helping the builders and the people involved in building those teams to go about like their work and their business and so on. Usually, this is a lot of like knowledge gathering and knowledge curation or connecting them to opportunities. There's also a lot of connection to various different funding sources, whether it's grant programs or investors in the VC side. And we're talking about in the tens of thousands of people over time funneling down to tens to hundreds of successful teams, right? So like that's the rough conversion rate. Here's like some range of the cumulative numbers over time. Again, 63,000 hackers supported over the history. So what I wanted to do this accounting of like a lot of the teams in the broad ecosystem. One interesting thing is a very significant large fraction of all of the teams in the Filecoin ecosystem found Filecoin or came in through the builder funnel that I'm describing. So a large fraction of them came in through hackathons. A significant fraction of them ended up going through some accelerator. A significant fraction ended up taking a grant at some point in time. We don't have that data across the entire Filecoin network in one place. We only have like a subset of that that we tend to see on a set of programs that a set of teams end up running. But it would be really useful to get that data to be visible ecosystem-wide, meaning we should have some dashboard that we can all go to where we can see the Filecoin-specific builder funnel. We can see all of the developers or builders that are trying to build things over time, how many of hackathon projects happen per period, how many grants are involved, how many accelerator programs and whatnot. And that kind of visibility would help all of us do a lot of our work on this. But in general, you can think of a lot of the teams that are here today in this Field of Summit as coming. Many of those ended up going through some of these kinds of programs, and many of the applications that now are key components of the Filecoin system at some point ended up assisted by some of these things. And so it's tricky to like be careful with like accidentally knocking out some component here, because then you'll only see that result years later, right? So if, for example, the whole ecosystem decided to like not do hackathons or whatever, you will only see that result 1 to 2 years later when you suddenly had a sizable decrease in numbers of teams. Cool. So then a quick view in the remainder of 2024. This is a set of hackathons that are happening, a set of fellowships and accelerators. So notably, there's going to be a hackathon here in Brussels in this weekend. There's going to be this is not a Filecoin specific hackathon; it's an Ethereum hackathon. There's a Filecoin related prize. There's some accelerators coming up: Longhash, Orange DAO, Kronos, Alliance DAO, Encode, Stanford, and then there's some other hackathons later in the year. I think ETH Online is a 4-week one. We just had Hackafest. Hackafest has been one of the most productive hackathons for the Filecoin community because it's a dedicated Filecoin-specific hackathon. many teams, including like secured finance and the others have come out of hackathons. Cool. Any thoughts, questions, discussion? I kind of wanted to frame the model here for everybody to kind of understand like why certain things look the way they do, but definitely want to make this a discussion with folks. Yep.
Thinking about stuff like PL Dev Guild, for example, where would you place that in this pipeline? Is that kind of a education-related thing that's accepting people who are relatively new, or is that more at the stage of micro grants where like potentially like an example is Shashank, who built a couple of different hackathon projects, just participated in HackFS, and is now a PL Dev Guild member, but taking kind of like a public goods track versus a like green startup oriented track. So where would you kind of place it? And how do you see that fit into this model?
For everybody, PL Dev Guild is a new program that's just beginning that's oriented towards supporting the open source developers. And it's trying to do it in a kind of like on-chain oriented way. The kind of like rough idea there is, say, if you had a pool of money that can be distributed out for developers in the ecosystem, how do you build some structures to support those developers and allocate the funding to the most impactful developers in the ecosystem that need it? And so we built a cohort-style program to support a set of individual developers contributing to open source. This is similar to Google Summer of Code. It's inspired by Google Summer of Code, but think of it as like PL Year of Code with a set of projects and using on-chain primitives to distribute the funding. So I would classify that as somewhere between the microgrants and accelerator piece for individual developers. It looks different because it's not building a team that ends up being say financially sustainable on its own. I could imagine a developer joining the Dev Guild for a while, staying there for somewhere between a quarter or like 2 years, and then eventually graduating from there to go start something separately themselves as a team that might get funding, or go join another team or something like that. There's one problem that the Dev Guild is trying to tune for, which is like when you think of like there's a huge gap between entry-level developers that are kind of like able to use some of the products and interfaces, but can't really contribute in the lower layers. And then people that like have the depth of knowledge in the infrastructure and the projects to be able to contribute largely. We're trying to tune the Dev Guild to help that step up, meaning create an environment for pretty talented but still relatively junior developers to be able to contribute meaningfully to deep infrastructure parts of the stack. So yeah, it's kind of like in the microgrants accelerator piece. It'd be great to have like, a version of this that has all the different programs mapped out and like where it fits with like the real numbers, right? Like that would be a really useful dashboard.
Okay.
Yeah,
Maybe I'll just ask my second question and then I'll hand off the mic, which was around prioritize. I think the Builders Funnel has been extremely productive in just like, many different hackathons, many different experimental projects. People have tried a lot of stuff. Obviously, the jump between a hackathon project and an accelerator or like investment scale project is like, it's a very strong filter. I'm curious how we should be investing as an ecosystem in like net new hackathon projects. Obviously, we need some amount of that because there's lots of innovation work versus say, spending more time from a builder enablement perspective with like larger scale, like drips and Gnosis Safe and like bringing larger scale tools that are already like past the investment stage into the Filecoin ecosystem, which then can make it a lot easier for people who are building new things to have larger scale building blocks. Like maybe it's a little bit orthogonal to the Builders Funnel structure, but I'm curious kind of in a ratio of investment or resource spend from a network perspective, how we should balance those two.
Yeah, so like I think for each of those kinds of programs that you might, each program you have to analyze in terms of what the cost of this program is going to be over time, like what's the overhead of running this thing, and what is the expected impact that you're going to get out of it. Like, is that going to be, you're going to diffuse, you're going to enable the growth of an individual developer in terms of their knowledge, or are you going to create an environment where they can actually do meaningful work and create something new, or create something that is already part of an existing project, like support some existing thing? And then you have to think about, like, what does the exit path out of that program look like? What is that kind of a supportive structure that then ends up compounding over time? So as an example, hackathons are fixed time programs that, you run a hackathon, you run it for a period of time and it ends. But the knowledge that people have gathered, have taken away there, or the relationships they've built with each other, is the thing that you're buying. Like, when you run a hackathon, the thing you're buying is individual developers growing their knowledge, trying to build something, getting to know each other, and then those relationships end up compounding over time. So often you'll see individuals who, like, participate in many hackathons, and then eventually, like, the third or fourth ends up being the one where, like, they make something that ends up being successful. One of the reasons we work very closely with ETH Global is, like, that's a team that, like, really gets this kind of flow. It's been really cool to see that there are many startups that come out of things like Hackafest and then end up coming back to support Hackafest itself, and end up being, set their own prizes and so on, and then create, like, a next generation of builders. And sometimes they end up meeting each other at these hackathons. So Ayush and Sushmit from Huddle met through Hackafest, and now, they're like a post-Series A company. And so these can be super productive. But again, like, we're probably missing more programs on the open source developer side of things. And I think that's, we've built the hackathons to accelerators pipeline. Like, that's sort of working. Sure, can always be improved. But I think the open source developers part is probably where there are more gaps. Yeah, Andrew?
You talked a little bit about how every stage of the funnel is really important. My understanding is that the grants programs used to be much larger than they are today. And I'm curious to know if you think they're right size to what we need in the funnel, and or other things that we can do to kind of bridge the hackathon to accelerator stage.
Yeah, I think good question. So I don't mean to say that every program that exists is very important. Like, I can guarantee you that every program that you can look at will have some amount of waste, and anyone will be able to say, oh, I can imagine a better way of doing this. What I'm more saying is, across the way, if you kind of, like, knock out some period and, like, there's just no program or, like, no funding there, then that'll create a big bottleneck that will only really show up in your metrics 2 or 3 years later. Like, you'll see it by, like, lacking a whole range of teams or something like that. And so I would say, like, what I'm pushing for is getting a lot more concrete visibility across this landscape with, like, all of the different programs that exist, to see how they're working, such that we can actually answer that question concretely of, like, how useful is this particular program. On the grants question specifically, I think a lot of the grant funding follows the available liquidity of funding, right? So if there's a lot of liquid funding, then grant programs tend to increase, and they tend to retract and so that's unideal, but it is kind of like a fact of, life. And so I think that's one of the pieces. The other piece is, grants tend to be, well, actually, like, all of this is really wasteful, like, when you think about it, right? If your conversion rate is, like, sub 1%, that's, 99% that you would think is, like, wasted. But in reality, you kind of have to buy the whole thing as I go. It's kind of like that marketing adage, right? Which is like, oh, I know that, like, half the advertising is effective, I just don't know which half. And so, like, surely we can, like, find areas where the grant making can be more productive or less wasteful, but it's fairly difficult to really know which thing ended up being successful, because you have to look at the long-term success of the individuals or the teams, not just the individual success in that project. Meaning, sometimes somebody gets a grant for something, they might fail in that grant, but then the fact that they had that experience ends up giving them some idea for something else, and they end up building it in the ecosystem. Yeah, I think Clara had a question. Yeah. Yeah, there's another talk I can.
And there's going to be an AMA at 4:15. But yeah, like, for right now, I think you can still do questions if anyone has anything very, very burning. So sure. I'm also going to do a conference on this topic. So yeah.
Right now, we do not have an equivalent of a promiscuous VC. That's the equivalent of consensus. Like early Ethereum was consensus, parity, and then everybody else. And the accelerators target like more experienced like VCs, and so we were missing between microgrants and accelerators something to like keep people in the ecosystem. Filecoin dev grants are average 50K, and they have to be open source. So there's something I think missing in the pipeline.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And this is like maybe the Dev Guild is a fit there, but I agree that's maybe not sufficient. There might be something else needed.
One idea, just while I'm passing the mic to Clara, I think we might experiment with the Solana-style convertible micro grants, where you do convertible grants, but then they maybe get paid back if you qualify for retro PGF or something, so that you're doing a prepayment, but that you can also recoup some of that to make it a bit more sustainable, and it encourages people to like push forward in the ecosystem.
Yeah, the big piece of this is you're trying to make it regenerative as much as you can. You can't make everything regenerative, but yeah. Claire?
Yeah, I wanted to highlight, we just revamped Filecoin Orbit, and I would love to brainstorm ways not only through hackathons and early education, but also getting the community more organically excited about hosting their own events. So people who just want to get together and build, as opposed to us funding a bounty at a hackathon to create that pipeline. So I would love to keep brainstorming there, because I think there's a lot of excitement we can drive to people that can just build naturally rather than through a hackathon. But I think hackathons are also great funnels as well. So I was curious of your thoughts on how to drive more organic community activity to get together.
I mean, I think I would look at it depends on kind of like what activity you mean there. Like I would look at it. I think thinking about it as a funnel is very helpful, because it enables you to separate the different stages, and you can then start measuring conversion rates across those. And so, if you think about events, for example, some events are tuned for, very early entry point type conversations. Some events are like deeper, like developer, where FieldDev is like deep into the pipeline in terms of developers. You like usually have to, are running some larger project, or contributing to a larger project. Whereas like, I don't know, like a much more, larger conference or larger summit might be like earlier. So I would say like think about that funnel and think about what's might be missing in that trajectory.
Yeah, I just wanted to address Andrew's point about it's definitely the field liquidity issue that made us have to change grants program in the way that we did, and it's much more focused now on people contributing things that enhance the usability or the tooling directly. Which in some ways is a little bit disappointing to me, and I wish we could do it slightly differently, because I do believe that one of the things with grants programs is like, they should be about innovation, and if you're only funding things that are a success, you're probably not being adventurous enough. I always use this example of like, if you only ever eat meals you really like in restaurants, that means you're being too conservative, and I think that's always a tension in the grants program as we have it.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I do think that a lot of this kind of support is highly exploratory, right? Like a hackathon by nature, very few of those projects are ever going to make it. But the point is like you're trying to create an opportunity for a reaction to happen, or for growth, for knowledge to grow. I will point out, like I'll maybe describe how a very smart team approaches this kind of problem. Like ETH Global has been extremely good strategy on this. Created an extremely high quality program, some of the best hackathons in the entire industry. And then they enable a bunch of other developer groups to come in and fund prizes to make it cash flow positive. And all the while, keeping Ethereum very front and center of every single hackathon. And then that by definition, creates like a ton of growth for the Ethereum community as a whole. And all of the supporters of each one of those hackathons end up supporting Ethereum, right? And so think of something kind of like that for Filecoin. Filecoin, I think, needs that version. I think we're kind of at a point where we need like a Filecoin specific type of thing, because in order to enable a lot of these other groups to help support and compound the growth of Filecoin. But again, hackathons is just one type of program. There could be others.
Yeah, and Claire, I would say like the Orbit program might actually sit before hackathons, where you have people who are building and prototyping and doing learning experiments like proto school courses or other like FEM in a box type things, even before they get to a full scale hackathon.
I think, where do you see the request for startups or kind of like, the prioritization of the network towards kind of like opportunities that the network recognizes would be very valuable to build and are feasible to build at this point with the technology, right? So we should make a case of not creating unrealistic expectations and aligning that request for startups and those open calls with where the tech is today. Maybe I'll give you like where my head is right now, and then we can discuss a little bit. I think hackathons are interesting in that they surface people and talent, which could then be regrouped into and deployed towards specific goals. If there is a alignment document or an alignment website, like an RFS, or there could be other instruments, you could potentially find really good talent in those hackathons and then attempt to reorganize it to pursue some of these opportunities, and then those could be accelerated by experimental microgrants, and then like move on to more mature instruments down the line. I have seen an uptick of hackathon attendees that are basically mining hackathon prices. So I have seen
that always
this
happens.
pattern. So I mean, it's really but there is an uptick, and like it wasn't as prevalent 3 years ago. People are taking there's a trend of people that are taking hackathons as their job, in terms of creating a project and trying to integrate 20 different SDKs that are all competing for bounties in very strange ways, and actually in some cases achieving some of those bounties.
But I think that's so we can point to any program here and find structural problems in that one, and then you have to address it. So what you're pointing out is, making hackathons productive is hard. And like the same thing goes for accelerators, and the same thing goes for microgrants. People could be trying to game any one of these. You mentioned also that hackathons, the hackathons produce people that can be reallocated. I think that's actually less likely. Like it happens, but the highest output that we've gotten from hackathons are teams that ended up making it to accelerators over time. Few, for 60,000 projects, there's been maybe, I think today there's maybe like 5 to 10 Series A companies, right? Like that's the punishing level of the conversion rate. And they probably about 20 made it to accelerators, but most of those have died at this point. But that's kind of like what that looks like.
Yeah, I think there's opportunity. I think we can leave the hackathon thing aside for a second, because I think it's a distinct topic. But I think there's opportunity in the ecosystem attempting to be a lot more focused on what it's trying to achieve of these builders that are going through the funnel, and that without leaving room for kind of like that experimentation that others were talking about, but by deploying this incoming talent into specific, giving them more direction. Optimism does this, for example, right? Optimism has 4 different pillars, I think, of what their continuous open calls. They also I'm not sure how structured they are in terms of like, the accelerator part and everything else. But for example, within the grants part that the foundation extends or the collective extends, there is different tiers. So if you have created a project that has proven itself, if you're new to the ecosystem, then you're able to access X amount of funding on your first grant. And then it's on you to validate that what you're onto and kind of like, your abilities and so on are worthy to perpetuate in the ecosystem. And if you do, then you unlock the next tier. And we're talking about like maybe 20K, then it goes up to 250K, and it can go up to $1 million, right? So it's a lot more structured as well in specifically the things that they're looking for. So there's 4 different pillars, and somebody wanting to contribute to the ecosystem knows ahead of time. Like they don't need to navigate a web of like potential opportunities that come up or be super creative. They can just kind of like.
So I agree. You're pointing out, hey, Optimism runs a set of programs, and each of those programs is well structured. Yeah, I think we run a set of programs, and each of those programs is well structured. But as a whole, Optimism has a wide swath of different programs. So the whole thrust of this talk and this funnel is to try and like get everyone to grok that you need different programs for different stages, and they achieve different things. And I 100% agree with you that good requests for startups or good pointers that help guide people towards things that can be solved help the entire pipeline, right? A good request for startups helps people in hackathons, helps people in microgrants, helps people at accelerator stage or even later. You can kind of deploy a request for startups in general, and that helps. And likewise, RetroPGF is another version of this. It's a program that like helps support a lot of the development over time of groups that are going to be producing valuable things for the ecosystem, and that can help teams across the entire pipeline. But the point of the funnel is like there are different stages, and those different programs have to be structured differently.